The fog rolls in low over the San Francisco Bay, a heavy, damp curtain that muffles the city lights across the water. Here on the island, the salt air clings to the thick concrete walls of the cell house. It is a late evening in August, but the wind off the Pacific carries the deep, biting chill of winter. The daytime ferries have long since departed, leaving behind a silence that is never truly silent. The dark water slaps rhythmically against the stone wharves. A seagull cries out just once before settling into the rocks. Inside the main building, the long shadows of the cell bars stretch across the floors, merging into a single expanse of gray. The night shift is beginning. A guard walks the length of a quiet corridor, his rubber-soled shoes squeaking faintly against the polished linoleum. He stops beside a small metal box mounted low on the wall, its lid hinged, a numbered key hanging from a short chain inside it. He lifts the key, and from beneath his coat produces a leather-cased recording clock slung on a strap over one shoulder. He inserts the key, turns it. There is a sharp, mechanical click. Somewhere inside the worn casing, a hidden mechanism presses the time and the number of this exact corridor onto a rolled strip of paper, a rhythm that will not stop until dawn.
Welcome. Tonight, we are going to step back in time, away from the noise and rush of the modern world, and onto a small, wind-swept outcrop of rock in the middle of San Francisco Bay. We are visiting Alcatraz, not as a tourist attraction, and not as the setting of Hollywood myths, but as a quiet, functional workplace during its operational years between 1934 and 1963. Over the next few hours, as you drift towards sleep, we will trace a single guard's shift from dusk to the first boat at dawn. We will walk the long, quiet corridors of the cell house. We will stand in the elevated gun gallery, watch the fog press against the reinforced glass, and listen to the steady, mechanical routines that governed every minute of life on the island. You will hear the gentle hum of the generators and the distant, rhythmic tolling of the buoy bells out on the water. The history of this island is not found in dramatic escapes or sensationalized conflicts. It is found in the quiet, methodical procedures of the night watch. It is found in the architecture of reinforced concrete, built between 1910 and 1912, and in the strict geometry of a space designed to hold time still. We will witness the mundane, precise details of a facility operating at maximum security while the rest of the country sleeps. As we move through the darkness, we will explore the quiet corners of this self-contained world, from the empty hospital ward to the wind-swept wharf. And by the end of the night, you will understand why the clock at Times Square, a simple timepiece hanging in a heavily guarded intersection of corridors, mattered more to the men in these cells than any calendar. Settle in. Let your breathing slow, matching the rhythm of the waves against the stone. The last boat has left for the mainland, and the long, quiet night on the rock is about to begin.
The thick, salt-stiffened hemp of the ferry's mooring line slips heavily off the rusted iron bollard of the Alcatraz wharf. It lands on the deck of the transport boat with a muted, heavy thud, followed immediately by the deep, rhythmic churning of the diesel engine shifting into reverse. The water between the concrete dock and the wooden hull of the boat begins to boil white, pushing the vessel out into the dark currents of the bay. On the dock, a night shift guard stands with his hands buried in the deep pockets of his wool overcoat, watching the gap of black water widen. The ferry blows its horn once, a low, mournful vibration that presses against the chest and echoes briefly off the sheer rock face of the island before being swallowed by the fog. The mainland, just a mile and a quarter away, has disappeared entirely behind a wall of gray mist. The city of San Francisco, with its cable cars, its glowing neon signs, and its rush of evening traffic, might as well be on another planet. As the stern light of the boat fades into the fog, the physical isolation of the island is complete. The transition from day to night on the rock is not marked by a setting sun, which is rarely visible through the marine layer, but by the departure of this final boat. It is a mechanical severing from the rest of the world. The wharf itself is a strictly controlled environment, a flat expanse of utilitarian concrete at the base of the island. Before the guard begins his ascent toward the main cell house, he must complete the initial perimeter checks of the dock area. The procedures here are slow, deliberate, and entirely standardized. He verifies the heavy steel padlock on the dockmaster's shack is secured. He visually inspects the shoreline immediately adjacent to the wharf, ensuring the incoming tide has not washed up any debris that could be used to damage the water pipes running along the seawall. He checks the operation of a specific piece of equipment positioned near the pedestrian gate, the teletouch metal detector system. Installed in 1934, at the same time the facility was being upgraded for maximum security, the teletouch system was considered highly advanced for its era. There are 3 of these early metal detectors on the island, one here at the wharf, one at the front entrance of the cell house, and one at the rear gate. The device at the wharf is built into an unassuming wooden frame that all personnel and visitors must pass through upon arrival. It operates using a series of delicate vacuum tubes and electrical coils housed in a locked metal cabinet. It does not beep loudly like modern security gates. Instead, it registers the presence of magnetic metals by triggering a small, quiet indicator light in the guard shack, accompanied by a soft mechanical hum. The guard pauses to ensure the small amber light on the control panel is illuminated, confirming the circuit is active and the lower boundary of the prison is secure. Satisfied, he turns away from the water and begins his walk.
You would expect the base of a maximum security fortress to be entirely desolate, a barren perimeter devoid of any warmth, color, or ordinary life. Instead, just a short distance from the industrial starkness of the dock, a remarkably different reality exists. Rising up from the lower slopes of the island is a small, quiet residential community that comfortably coexists with the penitentiary above. The guards and administrative staff do not just work on the island, their families live here. Large concrete apartment buildings, most notably Building 64, sit directly on the rock, alongside smaller cottages and duplexes. As the guard walks past the residential quarters, the severe atmosphere of the prison yields briefly to the mundane details of a working-class neighborhood in the mid-20th century. Beneath the steady sound of the wind, there are the faint, warm noises of domestic life settling in to the evening. A radio plays softly through a partially opened window, broadcasting a baseball game from the mainland. The smell of roasted chicken and boiling potatoes drifts out from a kitchen exhaust vent, cutting through the sharp scent of the ocean air. Children grew up here on this island. During the day, they rode their bicycles along the concrete retaining walls and drew with chalk on the old military parade ground. Each morning, they boarded a specialized ferry to attend school in San Francisco, returning in the afternoon to a home where the neighbors were prison guards and the backyard was a high-security perimeter. It is a quiet, functioning neighborhood, resting securely and safely in the shadow of the cell house. The family sleeps soundly here, entirely accustomed to the routines, the foghorns, and the proximity to the men housed at the top of the hill.
The guard leaves the residential area behind and begins the steep climb up the switchback path toward the crest of the island. The walk is physically demanding. The incline is sharp, designed to zigzag up the steep sandstone and shale cliffs. With each turn of the path, the wind picks up, whistling softly through the heavy diamond mesh wire fences that line the walkway. The temperature drops noticeably as he ascends. The island possesses its own highly localized microclimate, even when the city just across the bay remains warm and clear. The guard pulls his collar up, his rubber-soled boots crunching rhythmically against the loose gravel that has washed over the paved walkway. As he climbs, the sheer mass of the main cell house comes into view, looming out of the fog like a concrete mountain. The structure was not built by the civilian prison system. The cell house was constructed by military prisoners between 1910 and 1912, replacing an older wooden citadel. It is a staggering piece of engineering, measuring approximately 500 feet in length. The exterior walls are poured reinforced concrete, thick enough to withstand coastal artillery fire, and painted a pale institutional gray that easily disappears into the maritime weather. When the Federal Bureau of Prisons officially took control and opened the facility on August 11, 1934, they inherited this massive, cold structure and adapted it for a very specific purpose. Alcatraz was never intended to be a place of rehabilitation. It was designed to be the end of the line, a maximum security, minimum privilege facility meant to house the men who caused trouble in other federal prisons. It was built for containment and strict, unyielding routine. This mandate of absolute control dictated the staffing of the facility. To maintain order and enforce the rigid schedule, the Bureau of Prisons ensured the island was heavily manned at all times. The guard-to-inmate ratio here is approximately 1 to 3, a staggering density of supervision compared to other federal penitentiaries of the era, where a single guard might oversee dozens of men. This statistic is not merely a number on an administrative ledger. It is the defining reality of the workplace. For the guard walking up the hill, it means he is never truly alone in his duties, and the inmates inside are never truly unwatched. The architecture of the building and the volume of the staff work together to create an environment where every movement is observed, scheduled, and recorded. It is a system built on redundancy and constant, quiet vigilance. It remained this way day and night until the facility finally closed its doors on March 21, 1963. The guard reaches the top of the switchback and approaches the heavy outer doors of the main building. The wind is strongest here at the summit, pressing against the heavy glass of the entryway. He steps inside, and the heavy door pulls shut behind him with a hydraulic hiss, suddenly cutting off the roar of the wind. Inside the administrative section, the air is perfectly still and noticeably warmer. The corridors here smell faintly of carnauba floor wax, old metal, and the strong, bitter coffee brewing in the guard's break room. He moves through this transitional space, passing the quiet, darkened offices of the warden and the clerical staff. The walls are lined with locked filing cabinets and bulletin boards displaying typed duty rosters. The only sound is the rhythmic, metallic ticking of a large analog clock mounted above the master keyboard. He approaches the final set of heavy doors that separate the administrative offices from the main cell house floor. He pauses to check his equipment. He straightens the heavy leather belt at his waist, checking the position of his flashlight and the heavy brass key ring hanging at his hip. He steps through the doors, entering the vast, cavernous space of the cell house, but he does not step out onto the main floor where the inmates are housed. Instead, he turns immediately to his right, moving toward a solid, featureless steel door set flush into the concrete wall. He selects a long brass key from his ring, but it is not for a standard cell.
It is for a door that the men housed in this building are never permitted to touch, leading to an area they will never walk. He inserts the key, turns the heavy lock, and pulls the door open, revealing a narrow, enclosed staircase leading into the shadows. The precise structural geometry of what lies at the top of those enclosed stairs dictates the rhythm and safety of the entire night shift, and the reason for its strict physical separation will only become apparent once we stand inside it.
The toes of the guards' leather boots meet the grooved steel treads of the enclosed spiral staircase. The air trapped inside this narrow, windowless shaft is noticeably different from the administrative corridors below, carrying the distinct, sharp metallic tang of gun oil and brass polish. There is no natural light here, only the weak yellow glow of a single caged bulb mounted against the curved concrete wall. The guard ascends slowly, his hand trailing along the cold iron of the central banister. The acoustics of the stairwell magnify the sound of his movements, the rustle of his heavy wool coat, the faint clinking of the brass keys against his belt, and the rhythmic, hollow ring of his footfalls on the metal steps. He is climbing up into the architectural nervous system of the cell house, moving entirely out of sight from the main floor. At the top of the stairs, he faces another heavy steel door. Unlike the doors below, this one is secured with a complex double-throw deadbolt. The guard selects a different key, inserts it, and turns it twice. The mechanism slides back with a heavy, satisfying clunk that reverberates briefly in the small space. He pushes the door open, stepping out of the enclosed stairwell and into the elevated space known as the gun gallery. You would expect a maximum security patrol to require guards to march relentlessly past the cell bars, face to face with the men they are guarding, maintaining authority through sheer physical proximity. Instead, the daily reality of Alcatraz relies heavily on vertical segregation. The architecture was designed so that the most heavily armed personnel never actually share the same floor as the inmates. The gun gallery is a narrow, caged walkway suspended high above the cell block. It runs the entire length of the cell house, stretching out in a straight line that traces the outer wall of the building. The walkway itself is constructed of heavy steel grating, which allows the guards to look directly down onto the tiers below. More importantly, the gallery is physically separated from the inmates by a continuous wall of tool-resistant steel bars. This separation is absolute. No inmate has ever set foot inside this gallery. It is a secure bubble running along the upper perimeter of the prison, giving the officers a panoramic, unobstructed view of the facility while keeping them entirely out of reach. The visual scale of the cell house from this elevated vantage point is vast and rigidly geometric. Because the main building is approximately 500 feet long, the gallery stretches out like a long, dimly lit tunnel. The daytime lighting has been cut, replaced by a series of low-wattage night lights that cast long, intersecting shadows across the concrete floor far below. The cell blocks rise up in the center of the building like massive steel cages, stacked 3 tiers high. From up here, the guard can see the flat gray roofs of the cell tiers, thick with a layer of dust that no one ever sweeps, crisscrossed by electrical conduits and heavy steam pipes wrapped in canvas insulation.
The steam pipes are never completely silent. In the stillness of the night, they hiss and clank as the pressure fluctuates from the boiler room at the lower end of the island. The sound travels upward, echoing off the high vaulted ceiling of the main building. It is a mechanical heartbeat, a constant reminder that the facility is a massive machine requiring continuous, invisible energy to function. As the guard begins his patrol along the gallery, the steel grating hums slightly beneath his boots.
He walks at a measured, deliberate pace. There is no rush. The night shift is about the slow accumulation of hours, the steady observation of a space designed to remain completely static. Along the outer wall of the gallery, built into the reinforced concrete, are the armory lockers. During the day shift, guards stationed up here are equipped with Springfield .30 caliber rifles and M1911 semi-automatic pistols. They also have immediate access to heavy, brass-cased tear gas canisters, ready to be dropped through the grating onto the floor below in the event of a riot. But tonight, the weapons remain locked in their wall mounts. The night is about containment, not combat. The guard carries only a flashlight, a heavy wooden baton, and a small leather-bound logbook in his breast pocket to record his rounds. He stops at a designated observation point and leans slightly against the cold steel bars that separate him from the open air of the cell house. He looks down at the cell blocks. The standard cells, which make up the vast majority of the housing in B and C blocks, are small and identical. We will examine the exact dimensions and the severe interior of those cells later when we descend to the floor. From this height, they are simply a grid of dark rectangular openings. The silence inside the cell house is profound, but it is not absolute. With over 250 men sleeping in the stacked tiers below, the air is filled with the collective sounds of human rest. It is a heavy, rhythmic breathing that rises up to the gallery. Occasionally, there is the sharp scrape of a metal bed frame as a man turns over on his thin mattress, or a muffled cough that echoes briefly against the concrete walls. These are the normal, expected sounds of the night watch. If the cell house ever went perfectly silent, that is when the guard would know something was wrong. He continues his walk, moving past the high, arched clerestory windows that line the exterior wall of the gallery. These windows are made of thick, wire-reinforced glass designed to let in natural light during the day while preventing any possibility of escape. Tonight, they frame the shifting, impenetrable gray of the San Francisco fog. The wind off the bay howls against the glass, rattling the heavy steel window frames. Condensation has formed on the inside of the panes, cold to the touch and slowly dripping down the masonry. Every few seconds, a faint, rhythmic sweep of white light bleeds through the fog and briefly illuminates the frosted glass. It is the beam from the Alcatraz lighthouse, located just outside the cell house walls at the southern end of the island. The sweeping light acts as a silent metronome, washing over the walls of the gallery in a slow, endless rotation.
The guard reaches the far end of the long gallery. He has walked the entire length of the building without encountering another person, suspended in the air between the severe weather outside and the sleeping prisoners below. He turns and begins the slow walk back. His duty up here is to observe, to ensure that the physical structure of the cell house remains unbreached, and to provide overwatch for the guards patrolling the floor below. He pauses at the midpoint of the gallery and looks down again. From here, he has a clear, unobstructed view of the very center of the cell house floor. Below him, two main corridors intersect, forming a wide, open space in the middle of the cell blocks. The guards refer to this central avenue by a specific name, but what is most striking from this high angle is a piece of machinery suspended from the ceiling directly above the intersection. It is circular, its face glowing faintly in the dim light, its internal mechanisms quietly keeping pace with the night.
why the men below watch that specific, unremarkable object with such unbroken, obsessive intensity during the daylight hours is reality that only makes sense once you understand the crushing weight of time in this building, something we will explore after we descend to the floor itself. For now, the guard in the gun gallery completes his upper patrol, his footsteps ringing softly against the steel grating, entirely detached from the world below. Before we leave this elevated walkway and take our first steps onto the silent, polished concrete of the main floor, the cold air in the gallery seems to settle, leaving the vast building in perfect, heavy stillness. The island is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the wire fences above the bay, but inside the stone, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
At the base of the main cell block, mounted flush against the cold concrete wall, sits a heavy cast-iron gang box. Inside this locked cabinet rests a row of thick steel levers, each heavily coated in a thick layer of industrial lithium grease. These are the mechanical controls for the cell house doors, a complex system of interlocking gears, sliding steel flat bars, and heavy tumblers that run the entire length of the tier. During the day, the throwing of these levers produces a deafening metallic crash that echoes off the walls, the defining sound of Alcatraz. But tonight, the levers are firmly locked in the closed position, sealed behind the iron door of the gang box. The metal is cold to the touch, and the faint chemical smell of the grease mingles with the ever-present scent of carnauba floor wax. The guard reaches the bottom of the enclosed stairs and steps out onto the main floor. The soft squeak of his rubber-soled shoes against the polished concrete is the only sound breaking the stillness. You would expect a maximum security prison block to resemble a medieval dungeon, carved directly into the damp outer stone of the fortress, relying on the sheer thickness of the exterior walls to hold the men inside. Instead, Alcatraz utilizes a distinct architectural design known as the inside cell block model. The tiers of cells, designated primarily as B block and C block, are entirely freestanding structures built in the center of the vast cavernous cell house. They do not touch the exterior walls, nor do they touch the high vaulted ceiling. They are essentially massive rectangular steel and concrete cages constructed inside a larger protective shell. The guards can walk completely around the perimeter of these blocks, ensuring that even if an inmate miraculously managed to breach his individual cell wall, he would only find himself standing on a wide, well-lit corridor, still entirely trapped within the main building. The guard begins his patrol down the central avenue that bisects these two massive cell blocks. This long, wide corridor runs straight down the middle of the prison, flanked on both sides by 3 stacked tiers of barred doors. In the dark institutional humor of the guards and the inmates, the central thoroughfare was given a name. They call it Broadway. There are no glowing neon lights here, no theaters, and no rushing crowds. There is only a smooth, meticulously buffed concrete floor, stretching out straight and true under a line of caged, low-wattage nightlights. The floor has a dull, waxy sheen, the result of countless hours of inmate labor. During the day, men push heavy rotary polishing machines up and down this corridor, grinding the wax into the pores of the concrete until it reflects the overhead lights. The sheer width of Broadway was a highly deliberate choice by the original military architects. It was designed for unimpeded lines of sight. From one end of the corridor, a guard can see all the way to the other,
a long tunnel of forced transparency where nothing can be hidden and no movement goes unobserved.
Walking Broadway during the night shift is an exercise in measured hypnotic repetition. The guard moves at a deliberate, unhurried pace, staying perfectly centered in the corridor. He holds his heavy brass-cased flashlight in his right hand, but he does not keep it turned on. The ambient yellow light from the ceiling fixtures is sufficient for navigation. He only uses the beam when strictly necessary, sweeping it quickly and carefully into the cells as he passes. He is not merely counting heads. The procedure requires him to verify the presence of a living, breathing person. A lump under a coarse wool blanket is not enough to satisfy the rigid requirements of the night count. He must see skin, a hand resting outside the covers, the back of a neck, or the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of a shoulder beneath the fabric. As he shines his light into a cell on the bottom tier of B block, the beam briefly illuminates the harsh, unforgiving geometry of the space. The standard cells in B and C blocks are entirely identical, stripped of any excess, comfort, or individuality. They measure exactly 5 feet wide, 9 feet long, and 7 feet high. The physical reality of these dimensions is difficult to grasp until you stand inside one, surrounded by the heavy, poured concrete. 5 feet across means that if an average-sized man stands perfectly in the center of his cell and extends his arms, his fingertips can brush both the left and right walls simultaneously. 9 feet of length provides just enough room for a narrow steel folding cot, a small porcelain cold water sink, a lidless toilet, and roughly 3 short paces of walking space. The 7-foot ceiling ensures that taller inmates can easily press their palms flat against the concrete directly above their heads. It is an environment of absolute, unyielding confinement, a strictly measured box designed to hold a human being in the smallest manageable footprint. The walls of these standard cells are painted in 2 distinct tones, a dark utilitarian green on the lower half to hide scuff marks and dirt, and a pale institutional ivory on the upper half to reflect what meager light bleeds in from the corridor. There are no bars between the cells themselves, only solid concrete walls, completely isolating each man on his immediate neighbors on either side. The front of the cell, however, is entirely open to the corridor, secured only by a grid of thick, tool-resistant steel bars. This architectural choice creates a profound psychological paradox that defines daily life in B and C blocks. The men are completely physically isolated, locked in separate concrete vaults, yet they are entirely stripped of privacy. Every sound a man makes, every cough in the night, every turning of a page in a library book, every restless shift on a thin cotton mattress drifts freely out through the front bars and echoes into the wide open expanse of Broadway. Tonight, the men residing in these 5 by 9 by 7 spaces are asleep. The air in the corridor is thick and heavy with the collective rhythmic breathing of hundreds of men. Some sleep with their heads buried under their pillows to muffle the low, distant hum of the island's diesel generators. Others lie flat on their backs, their arms crossed stiffly over their chests. The uniform issue consists of a simple, thin cotton mattress, a single pillow, and coarse wool blankets. The blankets are heavy and scratchy, but absolutely essential against the damp, biting chill that constantly radiates from the concrete walls. The temperature inside the cell house is famously difficult to regulate. Even with the massive steam boilers working at maximum capacity at the lower end of the island, the heat struggles to penetrate the dense concrete blocks. The guard's own heavy wool overcoat feels barely adequate as a sharp, salty draft sweeps down Broadway from the upper ventilators. The silence of Broadway is a highly textured thing. It is never a true dead silence. The guard's rubber soles squeak softly, a rhythmic metronome marking his progress. The heavy steam pipes clank and hiss in the distance. The thick iron bars occasionally ping or settle as the temperature fluctuates in the dead of night. And then there are the sounds of the sleeping inmates themselves. Alcatraz is a place of forced, unbending routine, and for many men, the night is the only time they are temporarily free from the rigid schedule of counts, meals, and labor details. But sleep in a maximum security penitentiary is rarely deep or peaceful. As the guard walks, he hears a man muttering softly, nonsensically in his sleep on the second tier of C block. Further down the line, there is the sharp, sudden sound of a man thrashing against his metal cot, perhaps caught in a vivid nightmare, before settling back into a heavy, exhausted stillness. The guard does not pause. He does not shine his light to investigate the dream. He simply notes the presence of the man and keeps walking, letting the darkness close back in around the cell. There is a precise mechanical choreography to the night patrol. The guard must check every single cell on his assigned route, a methodical process that takes him up and down the open steel staircases at the far ends of the blocks, walking the narrow, caged galleries that run along the second and third tiers. He checks the locks mechanically, occasionally reaching out a gloved hand to test the tension of a crossbar. He is looking for anomalies, scanning for anything that breaks the strict visual order of the cell house. A piece of cardboard shoved discreetly into a locking mechanism, a blanket hung deliberately to obscure the view of a bunk, a pair of shoes left in the wrong position on the floor. Any deviation from the mandated standard is cause for immediate investigation. But tonight, the lines of sight remain perfectly clear. The locks are secure. The mechanical system holds fast against the night.
He finishes his sweep of the lower tier of B block and steps back out into the dead center of Broadway. He has walked roughly half the length of the cell house floor. Ahead of him, the long, straight corridor opens up into a wider, more brightly lit intersection. This is the central crossroads of the prison interior, the point where Broadway intersects perpendicularly with another hallway that leads to the administrative areas and the mess hall. As he approaches this intersection, the ambient light shifts noticeably, becoming brighter, reflecting sharply off the heavy layer of wax on the floor. Suspended from the ceiling directly in the center of this intersection is the object the guard in the gun gallery observed earlier from above. It is a large, two-sided analog clock, securely encased in a heavy wire mesh cage to protect it from tampering or vandalism. Its black hands move with a slow, relentless precision over a bright white face. The second hand sweeps in a smooth, continuous circle, cutting through the silence of the corridor. The guard passes directly beneath it, glancing briefly up at the time to log his progress. It is a simple, highly functional piece of equipment, completely identical to thousands of clocks hanging in factories, rail yards, and schools across the country. Yet, during the daylight hours, the men in the surrounding cells stare at this specific dial with an intensity that borders on desperation. We are drawing closer to understanding the crushing psychological weight of that clock, but its true significance is best explained when the morning routine finally begins. For now, the guard turns his back on the intersection and continues his patrol. He moves past the final cells of C block, walking toward the far northern end of the cell house. The air here begins to feel different,
The ambient, restless noise of the sleeping inmates fades slightly, replaced by a denser, heavier silence that seems to press inward. He reaches the end of the corridor and stops before a heavy, solid steel door that stands in stark contrast to the open bar gratings of the main blocks. There is a small, reinforced glass viewing window set at eye level in the steel, but it is covered from the outside by a sliding metal plate, locked tight. A thick bead of moisture has condensed along the cold iron threshold at the bottom of the door, pooling slightly on the concrete. The guard does not reach for his brass keys to open it. The procedures for entering the space beyond this solid door are entirely different, requiring a specialized protocol and the presence of a senior officer. He rests his gloved hand briefly against the cold metal, feeling a faint, rhythmic vibration echoing from the other side. Whatever is housed in the absolute darkness behind that solid steel barrier operates under a completely different set of rules, but the exact nature of that isolation will have to wait until he completes his outer perimeter check.
The heavy, black metal casing of the master clock is bolted securely into the reinforced concrete ceiling, suspended directly in the center of the intersection. Inside its protective diamond-patterned wire mesh cage, a specialized synchronous electrical motor drives the gears. When you stand directly beneath it in the dead of night, you can hear a faint continuous hum, a low electrical vibration that passes down through the metal housing and into the quiet air. The guard stops precisely in the center of the corridor beneath this hum. He tilts his head back, watching the long black second hand complete its smooth, sweeping arc across the brightly illuminated white dial. This specific intersection of polished concrete is the busiest and most heavily monitored choke point in the entire penitentiary. It is the wide junction where the main thoroughfare of Broadway perpendicularly meets the cross corridor leading to the dining hall, the administrative offices, and the recreation yard. Because of the constant, heavily regulated flow of foot traffic that passes through this exact spot during the daylight hours, the guards and the inmates independently gave it the same nickname. They call it Times Square. There is a profound, intentional irony in the name. The real Times Square in New York City is a place defined by unpredictable energy, flashing lights, and the chaotic freedom of a restless crowd. The Times Square of Alcatraz is a space defined by absolute, unyielding control. The floor here is worn smooth by thousands of identical, slow-shuffling footsteps. There are no advertisements on these walls, only the pale ivory paint and the stark, heavy steel of the surrounding cell blocks. And yet, this intersection was the center of the inmates' daily existence, primarily because of the object suspended above it. To understand why the men housed in B and C blocks watched this specific clock with an intensity that bordered on obsession, you must first understand the fundamental nature of the punishment at Alcatraz. The Federal Bureau of Prisons did not design this facility to inflict physical torment. The primary mechanism of control on the island was not the baton or the solitary cell, though those existed. The true weight of the prison was the absolute, crushing regulation of time. When a man was transferred to the Rock, he forfeited all autonomy over his own schedule. Every single action of his waking life was dictated by the movement of the hands on this clock face. He did not decide when to wake, when to sleep, when to eat, or when to speak. The clock made those decisions for him, and its authority was absolute. Consider the morning routine, a mechanical sequence that repeats without variation for years on end. At precisely 6:30 a.m., a heavy brass bell wired directly to the master clock system will ring out across the cell house. The men are expected to arise immediately.
They have exactly 20 minutes to wash in their small porcelain cold water sinks, dress in their standard-issue chambray shirts and denim trousers, and make their beds to strict military specifications. At 6:55 a.m., the first whistle blows. The men must step forward to the front bars of their cells for the morning count. At exactly 6:55 a.m., the doors open with a deafening crash, and the inmates march in a single, silent line through Times Square toward the dining hall.
They are allotted exactly 20 minutes to eat. The pacing of the meal is not determined by hunger or conversation, which is strictly monitored and often forbidden, but by the hands of the clock. When the 20 minutes expire, a guard blows a whistle. At that exact second, all forks must be set down on the steel trays. The meal is over, regardless of whether a man has finished his food. From there, the schedule dictates the work assignments: the laundry, the brush factory, the cobbler shop, each segment of the day chopped into precise, immutable blocks of hours and minutes. Because their lives were completely stripped of variety, the men clung to the schedule as the only tangible proof that time was actually moving forward. During the day, as they marched through the intersection, their eyes would flick upward to the wire cage. They were not checking the time to ensure they weren't late. The guards managed that. They were looking at the clock simply to verify that the second hand was still turning, that the day was actually progressing, and that they were one infinitesimal fraction of a moment closer to the end of their sentence. Some men became so attuned to the rhythm of the facility that they could guess the time to the exact minute based solely on the angle of the shadows cast across Broadway or the distant, scheduled blast of the island's steam whistle. But at night, the psychological weight of the clock shifts. For the sleeping men, time temporarily ceases to exist. For the guard standing in Times Square, time is the only thing that matters. The night shift is an exercise in endurance. There are no work details to supervise, no meals to monitor, and no movement to coordinate. There is only the slow, quiet accumulation of minutes. The guard reaches beneath his heavy wool coat and pulls out a small leather-bound logbook and a brass-capped fountain pen. The leather is worn smooth from years of handling, molded to the shape of his breast pocket. He unscrews the cap of the pen, revealing a fine steel nib. He checks the illuminated face of the clock above him. It reads 1:14 a.m. He carefully presses the nib to the lined paper of the logbook, the ink flowing dark blue against the pale page. The scratch of the metal on the paper is distinct in the quiet corridor. He logs his position, the exact time, and a standard notation indicating that the count is clear and the blocks are secure. He must document his patrol with absolute precision, creating a permanent written record of the night's slow progress. The Bureau of Prisons requires this log as proof of constant vigilance. If an incident were to occur, investigators would scrutinize these handwritten entries to determine exactly where every guard was positioned at any given minute. He caps the pen, slips the book back into his pocket, and pats the heavy wool flat against his chest. He takes a slow, deep breath. The air in Times Square is noticeably cooler than in the administrative wing, chilled by the drafts that sweep down from the high, vaulted ceiling.
He looks down the length of the cross corridor, away from Broadway. At the far end of this hallway lies the entrance to the dining hall, a massive space that currently sits in pitch darkness, filled with long, empty wooden tables and the lingering scent of industrial soap and boiled cabbage. To his left is the doorway to the library, where thousands of heavily censored books sit in perfectly aligned rows. Everything in this facility is organized, categorized, and bound by the rules of the schedule. The guard turns his attention back to the clock. The second hand continues its silent, electric sweep. It is a machine designed to impose order on a chaotic population. But there is a distinct limitation to its power. The clock in Times Square only exerts its authority if it can be seen or if the bells connected to it can be heard. The guard slowly lowers his gaze from the wire mesh cage and looks back down the long, polished stretch of Broadway, past the stacked tiers of B and C blocks. His eyes settle on the solid steel door he passed earlier, the one with the sliding metal plate over its viewing window. That door seals off a separate wing of the prison, an area designated as D Block. He knows that behind that heavy steel threshold, the rules of the facility fundamentally change. The men housed in the standard cells of Broadway may be ruled by the clock, but the men locked in the deepest sections of D Block do not see the sun, they do not hear the morning bell, and they cannot see the sweeping hands in Times Square. They exist in a space where the measurement of hours is stripped away entirely, replaced by something much heavier and far more disorienting. We will cross that threshold soon to see exactly how a prison handles men who refuse to obey the schedule. But before we follow the guard toward that absolute darkness, the cell house takes a final, quiet breath. The island is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the wire fences above the bay, but inside the stone, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
The steel track bolted into the ceiling above the entrance to the isolation ward is coated in a thick, black industrial lubricant that smells faintly of sulfur. Unlike the open, swinging barred gates that secure the ends of Broadway, the barrier separating the main cell house from this specific wing is a solid, impenetrable wall of plate steel. It does not swing on hinges. It is suspended on massive internal ball bearings along this overhead track. The guard approaches this threshold, but he does not reach for the standard brass keys at his hip. Instead, he selects a specialized elongated key and inserts it into a wall-mounted control box beside the frame. He turns the mechanism, grasps a heavy iron handle welded to the door, and pulls. With a deep, grinding rumble that vibrates through the floorboards and travels straight up into the soles of his boots, the heavy steel door slowly retracts along the greased track. The air that spills out from the resulting gap is immediately and noticeably different from the rest of the prison. The drafty, salt-tinged chill of the main cell house is gone. The atmosphere inside this enclosed space is stagnant, heavy, and artificially warm, carrying the sharp metallic scent of rust mixed with the faint, sour odor of unwashed cotton and strong carbolic soap. The guard steps through the threshold. He pulls the heavy handle backward, and the door slides shut behind him with a hydraulic hiss, locking into place with a definitive, hollow boom. The ambient noise of the main floor, the distant clanking of the steam pipes, the collective breathing of hundreds of sleeping men, the ticking of the clock at Times Square, is instantly and completely severed. He has entered D Block. This is the isolation ward, a specialized, self-contained environment engineered specifically for men who refuse to assimilate into the strict, unyielding routine of the general population. You would expect a punishment block within a maximum security penitentiary to be a chaotic environment, characterized by shouting, friction, and constant noisy defiance. Instead, at this hour, D Block is defined by an absolute, crushing stillness. The architecture here was deliberately designed to dampen sound, restrict visual interaction, and create a profound sensory vacuum. The physical layout of D Block differs significantly from the open expanses of Broadway. While it is still an inside cell block model, it is smaller, containing only 42 cells, arranged in a single three-tiered bank facing a flat expanse of exterior wall. The windows on this opposing wall are covered, allowing only thin slivers of gray light to penetrate during the day. At night, it is a cavern of deep, intersecting shadows. As the guard begins his slow, measured patrol down the short corridor, his rubber soles squeaking faintly against the concrete, he moves past distinct zones of confinement, each representing an escalating level of institutional control.
Segregation cells. The upper tiers are lined with units that visually resemble the standard cells in B and C blocks, with traditional barred fronts facing the corridor. However, the men housed here live under entirely different operational rules. They are strictly confined to these small spaces for up to 24 hours a day. They do not join the morning march to the dining hall. Their meals are delivered directly to their cells on metal trays. They are not assigned to work details in the brush factory or the laundry. Their entire existence is reduced to the view through the bars and the rigid schedule of the guard patrols. Close confinement. On the lower level, a specific section of cells features an additional layer of architectural security. These are known as the close confinement cells. In front of the standard steel bars, a second door made of heavy, tightly woven wire mesh is installed. This creates a small enclosed vestibule between the inmate and the corridor. This extra barrier serves a dual purpose. It physically distances the inmate from the guards, preventing them from throwing objects, and it further mutes any attempted conversation, filtering out the human voice until it is little more than a muffled drone. The hole. At the very end of the bottom tier, sequestered in the darkest corner of the building, sit 6 specific units that represent the most severe form of incarceration in the federal system. These are the fully dark solitary cells, numbered 9 through 14. The guard walks past the segregation and close confinement units, his flashlight remaining off, relying only on the dim amber glow of the caged nightlights. He stops in front of the final cell in the row. This is cell 14D, historically the most notorious of the 6 solitary units, due to its position at the end of the block, where the concrete absorbs the most cold from the outer walls. There are no open bars here. The front of cell 14D is a solid, featureless slab of heavy steel, completely flush with the surrounding concrete. There is a small viewing window set at eye level, but it is covered by a thick metal plate that is locked tight from the outside. Near the floor, a narrow, rectangular slot allows a flat food tray to be pushed through, but its heavy hinged cover is currently secured with a padlock. To understand the reality of cell 14D, you must strip away sensationalized myths of physical torture and focus purely on the methodical mechanics of sensory deprivation. When a man is placed inside this specific cell, he steps into a space that measures roughly the same 5 by 9 dimensions as a standard cell, but with a critical defining difference. There is absolutely no light, and there is no furniture. The interior is stripped to bare concrete. There is no porcelain sink, only a cold water spigot protruding from the wall. There is no lidless toilet, only a small drain hole in the floor for waste. The flushing mechanism for this drain is located out in the main corridor, operated only at the discretion of the guards. During the daylight hours, the inmate is provided no mattress and no blankets. He is forced to sit, stand, or pace on the freezing concrete floor, wearing only his standard issue uniform.
Only at night, when the rest of the prison settles into sleep, does the routine shift slightly. A guard will unlock the heavy, solid door, pull back the inner barred gate, and hand the inmate a thin cotton mattress and a wool blanket. At dawn, these items are immediately confiscated. When the heavy steel door of cell 14D swings shut and the exterior deadbolt is engaged, the interior becomes completely devoid of photons. It is a darkness so absolute and impenetrable that an inmate cannot see his own hand resting a single inch from his face. Without light, the psychological concept of time begins to disintegrate almost immediately. In Broadway, the men have the clock at Times Square and the sweeping beam of the lighthouse to anchor them to reality. Inside the hole, those anchors are gone. The morning bells are heavily muffled by the thick steel door. The days and nights blur into an endless, continuous present. The human brain, starved of external input, begins to search for any pattern it can find. Men housed in these 6 cells frequently try to maintain their grip on a structured reality by engaging in repetitive, mechanical actions. A common practice is for an inmate to tear a single button from his denim trousers, toss it high into the pitch-black air, listen carefully for the tiny click of the plastic hitting the concrete, crawl on his hands and knees in the dark until he finds it, and then throw it again. This process is repeated hour after hour, a self-generated schedule designed purely to prove that time is still passing. Tonight, cell 14D is occupied. The operational procedure for the night watch in this specific section is highly rigid. The guard must verify the presence and the welfare of the inmate inside, but doing so presents a procedural challenge. Opening the solid steel door breaks the isolation, floods the cell with corridor light, and requires the presence of multiple officers for security. Furthermore, using a flashlight is impossible due to the sealed viewing plate. Instead, the guard performs a specialized sensory check. He steps up to the flat steel slab of the door. He does not tap on the metal, and he does not speak. He simply turns his head, places his ear against the cold, painted surface of the door, and holds his breath. He is listening for a sign of life, a physical acoustic confirmation that the man inside is still breathing. For a long, stretched minute, there is nothing but the heavy silence of the block. The thick steel isolates sound almost perfectly, but if he presses close enough, and if the corridor is completely still, the micro sounds of human existence eventually transfer through the metal. He hears it. It is a faint, rhythmic, dragging sound coming from the other side of the barrier. It is the sound of a rubber-soled shoe sliding slowly back and forth across the rough concrete floor. The man inside is awake. He is pacing the tiny, invisible dimensions of his lightless box, walking exactly 3 steps forward, turning and walking 3 steps back, measuring his existence by the physical boundaries of the walls he cannot see.
The guard pulls back from the door. He reaches beneath his heavy wool coat and withdraws his leather-bound logbook and fountain pen. Holding the book up to catch the dim light of the corridor, he carefully unscrews the cap and logs the exact time and a brief notation indicating movement in cell 14D. The scratch of the steel nib against the paper echoes sharply, a sudden bright noise in the heavy stillness of the ward. He caps the pen
and returns it to his pocket. He has completed the security check of the whole. The machinery of total isolation is functioning exactly as it was engineered to perform. He turns away from the solid steel doors and begins his slow walk back toward the sliding entrance of D Block. The stagnant air continues to press in on him, heavy with the weight of absolute confinement. The silence of the isolation ward is designed to be complete, to sever the men within it entirely from the outside world, to make them forget that anything exists beyond the concrete. And yet, as the guard reaches the massive sliding steel door that will lead him back to the relative openness of Broadway, he pauses with his hand on the heavy iron lever. The original military architects of Alcatraz built these walls thick enough to withstand coastal artillery shells, and they installed steel heavy enough to break a man's spirit, but they could not completely seal out the natural environment. Through the dense, reinforced concrete of the outer wall, bleeding through the floorboards and vibrating faintly through the heavy metal tracks of the door, comes a sound that even the darkest cells of D Block cannot entirely escape. It is a low, mournful, highly rhythmic vibration. It is a mechanical tone, entirely detached from the prison's internal clocks or the guard's routine. The source of that sound sits out in the freezing, turbulent currents surrounding the island, and understanding its purpose is essential to understanding how this isolated rock survives the night. We will step outside the cell house to examine it momentarily. But for now, the guard pulls the heavy lever, the steel door grinds open, and he steps back out into the pale, drafty light of Broadway, leaving the absolute darkness of D Block sealed behind him. The island is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the wire fences above the bay, but inside the stone, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
A thick, heavily oxidized copper wire runs along the exterior concrete wall of the main cell house, secured every few feet by rusted iron brackets. It travels upward into the dark, connecting to a mechanical anemometer mounted near the roofline, its metal cups spinning in a rapid, continuous blur against the night sky. At the base of this wall, a heavy steel exit door pushes outward. The guard leans his shoulder into the metal, forcing it open against the sheer weight of the maritime wind. He steps out onto a narrow exterior catwalk, and the heavy door slams shut behind him, the latch dropping into place with a sharp metallic crack that is instantly swallowed by the roar of the air. He has left the stagnant, tightly controlled atmosphere of the interior corridors and stepped directly into the raw, abrasive weather of the San Francisco Bay. The transition is violent. The wind here does not blow in gusts. It is a steady, unrelenting pressure that pushes against his heavy wool overcoat, forcing him to lean slightly forward as he walks. The air is saturated with a fine, freezing mist. It is not exactly rain, but rather the low-hanging fog physically condensing against the island, coating the reinforced concrete walls in a slick, dark layer of moisture. The guard pulls the collar of his coat up around his neck, his rubber-soled boots finding traction on the textured steel grating of the catwalk. His duty now requires him to perform an exterior perimeter check, walking the high, exposed ridge of the island to ensure the outer boundaries of the facility remain secure. From this vantage point, the true isolation of Alcatraz becomes immediately apparent. There is no visible horizon. The city of San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge, the hills of Marin County, they have all been erased by a thick, featureless wall of gray fog. The island feels entirely disconnected from the earth,
a solitary rock drifting in a void. But while the visual world has been completely reduced to a few feet of illuminated concrete, the acoustic world of the bay is vast, complex, and impossible to ignore. The low, mournful vibration that bled through the heavy steel doors of D Block originates here, at the southern tip of the island. It is the Alcatraz foghorn, a massive piece of maritime engineering designed to warn shipping traffic away from the treacherous shoals that surround the rock. The mechanism itself is a diaphone horn, operated by heavy industrial air compressors housed in a small utilitarian building near the lighthouse. The compressors run constantly on foggy nights, forcing air into large steel holding tanks. On a rigidly timed schedule, a heavy mechanical valve opens, releasing the pressurized air through a slotted piston. The result is a deep, two-tone blast that does not simply travel through the air, it physically vibrates the surrounding environment. The sound begins as a massive guttural bass note, holding steady for precisely 3 seconds, followed immediately by a sharp descending grunt. Then there is exactly 27 seconds of silence. Then the blast repeats. It is a mechanical cycle that continues endlessly, hour after hour, until the sun finally burns the marine layer away.
For the guard walking the catwalk, the sound is deafening. He feels the low-frequency vibration in his chest and in the soles of his boots. But for the inmates locked in the 5x9 standard cells of B and C blocks, the foghorn is something else entirely. Because the cell house was constructed by military prisoners between 1910 and 1912 using massive pores of reinforced concrete, the walls are thick enough to muffle higher frequencies. The sharp sounds of the wind and the crashing waves are filtered out, but the low, heavy bass notes of the diaphone horn penetrate the porous stone with ease. Inside the cells, the horn is a constant, muffled groan, a rhythmic reminder of the cold, dark water that surrounds them. The water itself is the ultimate security feature of the prison. You would assume that a maximum security facility relies primarily on its walls, its iron bars, and its armed personnel to prevent escapes. And while the Federal Bureau of Prisons did maintain a staggering guard-to-inmate ratio of approximately 1:3, the true deterrent to escape lay just beyond the rocky shoreline. San Francisco Bay is not a still, quiet moat. It is a massive, constantly shifting volume of cold ocean water driven by complex tidal forces. Twice a day, the tide funnels millions of gallons of water through the narrow choke point of the Golden Gate, creating powerful, unpredictable currents that sweep directly past Alcatraz Island. Even on a calm night, the water moves at a speed that can easily overpower a strong swimmer. Furthermore, the temperature of the water rarely rises above 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and during the winter months it often drops into the high 40s. If a man were to miraculously breach the reinforced concrete walls of the cell house, bypass the exterior patrols, and slip into the bay, the cold would begin to shut down his muscular function within minutes. The architects who repurposed this military fortress into a federal penitentiary understood this geography perfectly. They did not need to build a higher wall around the island. The Pacific Ocean had already provided an impenetrable barrier. The guard continues his patrol, his flashlight beam cutting a pale, conical path through the driving mist. He walks along the high retaining wall that overlooks the recreation yard, a flat expanse of concrete, now slick with moisture, completely empty in the dark. The chain-link fencing that surrounds the yard rattles steadily in the wind. Below the island, out in the invisible expanse of the bay, another sound joins the steady rhythm of the foghorn. It is a lighter, more erratic noise, drifting in and out of perception depending on the direction of the wind.
It is the high, hollow clanging of a bell buoy. The United States Coast Guard maintains several of these navigational aids in the waters surrounding Alcatraz to mark the edge of the shipping channels. Unlike the motorized, rigidly timed foghorn on the island, the bell buoy is entirely at the mercy of the ocean. It consists of a large floating steel hull equipped with a heavy brass bell and multiple free-swinging clappers. As the dark swells of the bay lift and drop the heavy buoy, the clappers strike the outside of the bell in an unpredictable, arrhythmic sequence.
The sound is distinct. A sudden sharp ring, followed by a long pause, then 2 quick strikes, then silence. It is a lonely, metallic clatter that travels easily over the surface of the water. For the men lying awake in the cell house, this sound is heavily weighted with psychological significance. The buoy is a piece of the outside world. It is a marker for the civilian cargo ships, the oil tankers, and the passenger ferries that pass by the island every single day, completely oblivious to the rigid, silent routines taking place inside the concrete walls. To hear the buoy is to be reminded that the rest of the world continues to move freely, while time inside the prison stands entirely still. The guard reaches the end of the catwalk and pauses at the corner of the building. From here, he has a clear view of the Alcatraz lighthouse rising up from the southern end of the rock. The tower is a stark white cylinder, though in the dark and the fog, it appears only as a faint, glowing silhouette. Inside the lantern room at the top of the tower, a large, multifaceted Fresnel lens rotates on a bed of liquid mercury. As it turns, it catches the light of a high-wattage electrical bulb and focuses it into a concentrated, piercing beam. Every 15 seconds, this intense shaft of white light sweeps across the fog, illuminating the mist like a solid wall before continuing its slow, silent arc over the bay. The beam washes over the exterior of the cell house, briefly throwing the heavy steel bars of the windows into sharp, black relief against the pale concrete. The guard stands still, allowing the light to sweep over him. For a fraction of a second, the heavy brass buttons of his overcoat gleam brightly, and the rain on the steel catwalk flashes white. Then, the darkness rushes back in to fill the void. This environment, the driving wind, the freezing fog, the rhythmic blast of the horn, the erratic clatter of the buoy, and the sweeping beam of the lighthouse, is the constant, unyielding reality of the island's exterior. It is a harsh, industrial, maritime landscape that offers no comfort and no shelter. The men inside the cell house are protected from the elements, but they are deeply aware of them, trapped within a fortress that is itself trapped within the ocean. The guard turns his back to the wind and prepares to re-enter the cell house. He reaches for the heavy iron handle of the exterior door. His patrol of this upper perimeter is complete. The physical boundary between the prison and the water remains secure. Before he pulls the door open, he pauses and looks down the southern slope of the island, away from the sweeping light and the roaring bay. Through the thick mist, further down the rock and sheltered slightly from the worst of the wind, he can make out the faint, warm, yellowish glow of a street lamp illuminating a patch of paved road. And just beyond that lamp, barely visible in the dark, sits a concrete residential building. It is easy to assume that every structure on this desolate rock serves the purpose of punishment or observation. But the people sleeping behind the glass in that building down the hill are not prisoners, and they are not guards on duty. How an entirely ordinary domestic neighborhood manages to function within the confines of a maximum security perimeter is a strange and quiet contradiction, one that requires a closer look at the structures resting just below the prison walls.
On the flat concrete terrace just below the main switchback path, a child's metal tricycle sits abandoned for the night. The freezing mist sweeping off the bay has coated its curved, painted handlebars with a thin sheen of water, which slowly gathers into heavy drops. The drops fall onto the pavement with a faint, rhythmic tap, a tiny sound almost entirely lost beneath the roar of the wind. Behind the tricycle, a large ground-floor window of a massive concrete apartment block is cracked open a fraction of an inch. Through that narrow gap, drifting out into the cold, salt air, comes the steady, low-frequency hum of a kitchen refrigerator compressor. You would expect a maximum security penitentiary designed for the country's most unmanageable inmates to be a place of total, uncompromising desolation, a barren rock inhabited only by armed men and the prisoners they guard. Instead, just a few hundred yards down the steep incline from the cell house walls, an entirely ordinary, functional residential neighborhood exists in quiet defiance of the prison above. The guards and administrative staff of Alcatraz did not commute across the bay at the end of their shifts. They lived here on the island, and they brought their families with them. The structure housing the cracked window is Building 64, originally constructed to serve as a military barracks during the island's time as a coastal defense fort. It is a massive 3-story block of poured concrete resting on the eastern slope of the rock. When the Federal Bureau of Prisons took over the facility, they retrofitted this enormous building into comfortable multi-room apartments for the officers and their dependents. Alongside Building 64, a series of smaller, standalone wooden cottages and duplexes were built along the winding roads, assigned to senior staff based on rank and seniority. Tonight, the families inside these apartments are fast asleep. The domestic quiet of this civilian sector stands in sharp, bizarre contrast to the rigidly controlled silence of the cell blocks just up the hill. Behind the locked doors of Building 64, there are living rooms furnished with overstuffed floral armchairs and heavy mahogany console radios. There are kitchens lined with linoleum flooring where dishes sit drying in wire racks beside the sink. Bedrooms are wallpapered in soft, pale patterns, completely hiding the thick, blast-resistant concrete of the exterior walls. Living in the shadow of America's most secure prison required a unique compartmentalization, a strict separation between the violent reality of the workplace and the mundane routines of domestic life. The families adapted to the harsh maritime environment and the proximity of the inmates with remarkable ease. For the wives of the guards, the island was simply a small, tightly knit, somewhat isolated small town. They organized bridge clubs and sewing circles that met in the afternoons. Because there was no supermarket on the rock, household logistics required careful advance planning. The women filled out detailed grocery lists each week and dropped them into a wooden collection box near the dock. A grocer on the mainland in San Francisco would fulfill the orders, pack the produce, milk, and canned goods into sturdy wooden crates and load them onto the transport ferry. Once the boat arrived, the crates were hauled up the steep incline of the island, delivering mainland domesticity directly to the heavy concrete doorsteps.
The physical landscape of the residential areas was completely devoid of natural topsoil. Alcatraz is composed entirely of sandstone and shale. To make the neighborhood feel like a home, families imported dirt from the mainland, hauling it up the hills in heavy canvas sacks to create terraced gardens. Even in the dark, the thick, fleshy leaves of the ice plant and the thorny vines of climbing roses can be seen clinging to the retaining walls. Carefully cultivated patches of color and life, cultivated against the gray stone. But it is the presence of children that truly underscores the strange duality of the island. Throughout the operational years of the prison, there were consistently between 60 and 80 children living on Alcatraz at any given time. For them, the penitentiary was not a source of terror. It was simply the backdrop to their childhood, a massive, quiet neighbor at the top of the hill. Their daily routine was dictated by the ferry schedule. Every weekday morning, the island's children would walk down the steep, winding switchbacks, carrying their tin lunchboxes and leather satchels. They would gather on the wooden wharf and board a specialized morning transport boat, affectionately known as the Alcatraz Special. This boat carried them across the 1.25 miles of choppy, treacherous water to the mainland, where they dispersed to various public schools in San Francisco. In the afternoon, the process reversed. They would ride the ferry back into the fog, disembark at a maximum security checkpoint, and walk up the hill to play baseball on the old military parade ground. However, growing up on the Rock came with a rigid set of specialized rules, strictly enforced by both the parents and the Bureau of Prisons. The perimeter of their freedom was absolutely defined. The children were forbidden from approaching the main cell house, the industry workshops, or the upper recreation yard. They were instructed to look away if a line of inmates on a work detail passed by in the distance. More specifically, there was a blanket prohibition on certain types of toys. No child on Alcatraz was permitted to own or play with a toy gun, not even a brightly colored water pistol or a wooden cutout. This rule was not born out of pacifism, but of absolute pragmatic security. The administration feared that if an inmate managed to obtain a realistic-looking toy discarded by a child, he could use it to bluff his way past a guard, holding a piece of painted tin to an officer's back in the dark. The line between domestic play and fatal security breach was razor thin, and the children were taught early to respect it. Yet, despite the proximity to bank robbers, kidnappers, and men considered irredeemable by the federal government, the civilian population of Alcatraz paradoxically considered it one of the safest neighborhoods in America. Crime within the residential community was virtually non-existent. No one bothered to lock their apartment doors at night. The logic was simple. The island was guarded by heavily armed men 24 hours a day, surrounded by freezing water and treacherous currents. It was, in effect, the ultimate gated community. The residents slept soundly, lulled by the rhythmic, sweeping flash of the lighthouse beam across their bedroom ceilings and the heavy, muffled blast of the foghorn.
As the night deepens, the residential sector remains perfectly still. The heavy cast-iron radiators in the apartments of Building 64 hiss faintly, bleeding steam heat generated by the massive boilers located down at the powerhouse. The damp, salty air presses against the window panes. The guard we followed earlier does not patrol these civilian corridors. The security of the families is considered absolute, protected by the sheer isolation of the island itself. The night watch is focused purely on containment, looking inward at the cell blocks, not outward at the sleeping children. Down here, near the base of the rock, the harsh angles of the prison soften into the rounded, practical shapes of daily life. The concrete patio where the tricycle rests is bordered by a low, whitewashed wall. Beside it, a heavy wooden door leads to the basement of the apartment block, a space the residents transformed into a social club, complete with a small 2-lane bowling alley installed decades earlier by the military. During the evenings, the heavy wooden thunder of bowling balls rolling down the polished maple lanes would echo through the foundation, a sound of ordinary leisure masking the heavy industrial silence of the prison above. Tonight, the alley is locked, dark, and silent.
The existence of this community proves that the island was not a machine composed entirely of steel bars and tear gas. It was a complex, multi-layered ecosystem requiring a vast amount of civilian infrastructure to support the punitive mechanics at the summit. But this domestic tranquility was completely dependent on the absolute, uncompromising security of the perimeter. Every single item that made life on the rock possible, every crate of glass milk bottles, every canvas sack of imported garden soil, every letter from the mainland, and every family member returning from the city had to arrive by boat. They all had to pass through a single, highly specialized and heavily monitored bottleneck at the water's edge before they were permitted to climb the hill. Down at the base of the island, where the concrete gives way to the thick wooden pilings of the wharf, the water continues to slap against the dock. Inside a small, dark guard shack near the pedestrian gate, a delicate array of vacuum tubes and electrical coils sits quietly humming, maintaining a silent watch over the threshold. Why this specific, unassuming machine was deemed more critical to the island's survival than the armed officers standing beside it is a matter of strict procedural security, one that becomes clear only when you understand exactly what the guards were looking for in the dark.
Inside the small, weather-beaten wooden guard shack at the base of the Alcatraz wharf, the air smells sharply of hot dust and electrified ozone. This distinct metallic odor radiates from a vented gray steel cabinet securely bolted to the beadboard wall, suspended just above a small, heavily scratched wooden desk. Inside the cabinet, visible through a narrow mesh grill, a bank of delicate glass vacuum tubes glows with a steady, warm orange filament in the dark. They hum quietly, producing a low-frequency electrical vibration that provides the only trace of heat in the freezing, drafty room. The night guard assigned to the dock sits heavily in a wooden chair beneath this cabinet. He rests his hands around a ribbed aluminum thermos of black coffee, listening to the relentless, rhythmic swelling of the bay outside. The tide is coming in, pushing cold, dark water against the thick, creosote-soaked wooden pilings of the dock. The kelp anchored to the lower rocks slaps wetly against the concrete seawall. The shack itself shudders very slightly whenever a particularly heavy swell rolls in from the Golden Gate. This gray steel box humming on the wall is the control unit for the Teletouch metal detector system. When the Federal Bureau of Prisons assumed control of the island and officially opened the penitentiary on August 11, 1934, they initiated a massive multi-million-dollar upgrade to the existing military infrastructure. They installed the tool-resistant steel bars across the cell fronts, they constructed the elevated gun gallery we walked through earlier, and they completely overhauled the locking mechanisms. But the architects of this new maximum security environment recognized that heavy physical barriers were only one half of the security equation. They needed a way to scan and control the invisible boundaries of the island, and the Teletouch system was their state-of-the-art solution. 3 of these early electromagnetic detectors were installed at the facility's critical choke points, one at the front entrance of the cell house, one at the rear gate leading to the recreation yard, and this primary unit here at the pedestrian gate on the wharf. You would expect the primary operational anxiety of a heavily fortified prison to be focused entirely on men breaking out. Instead, the daily, unrelenting stress for the guards stationed at the perimeter was focused almost entirely on preventing objects from breaking in. Alcatraz was a highly complex, densely populated ecosystem, but it was absolutely not self-sustaining. The rock itself produced nothing. There were no natural freshwater springs, no agricultural plots, and no fuel reserves. Every single drop of fresh drinking water,
Every gallon of diesel fuel for the powerhouse generators, every crate of canned peaches for the dining hall, and every piece of incoming mail had to be brought across the bay by boat and unloaded on this specific dock. Furthermore, to keep the inmates occupied and to generate revenue for the Bureau, the penitentiary operated a massive industrial laundry service for the local military bases on the mainland. Throughout the week, Army and Navy boats would arrive at the wharf, offloading huge, tightly bound canvas bales of dirty uniforms from Fort Mason and the Presidio. Identical bales of clean laundry were constantly being loaded back onto the boats for the return trip.
This sheer volume of daily logistical transfer created a massive vulnerability. Metal is the universal currency of escape, disruption, and violence within a prison. A smuggled hacksaw blade, a small steel file, a disassembled revolver part, or even a heavy piece of threaded iron pipe could completely alter the balance of power inside the cell blocks. The administration knew with absolute certainty that the inmates' associates on the outside would inevitably attempt to hide contraband within the daily shipments, or that a compromised civilian worker might try to carry a weapon in their heavy coat pocket. The teletouch system was designed to eliminate this blind spot. Just outside the window of the guard shack, exposed to the freezing mist, the sea salt, and the driving wind, stands a simple, unassuming wooden archway. It looks like a standard freestanding door frame, but all arriving personnel, visitors, and specific types of hand-carried cargo must pass directly through it before they are permitted to walk up the switchback path. Built securely into the thick wooden uprights of this archway are heavy electrical coils. The gray cabinet inside the shack generates a continuous, invisible electromagnetic field across the open gap of the frame. When a person or a wooden crate passes through, the magnetic field remains stable and undisturbed. But if a ferrous object, a gun barrel, a knife blade, or a heavy steel file passes through the invisible curtain, the metal disrupts the magnetic lines of force. Unlike modern airport security gates, the teletouch system does not emit a loud, piercing electronic beep. The engineers who designed the system understood the physical realities of the Alcatraz dock. A loud audio alarm on a wharf swept by heavy coastal winds, the deep blasts of the foghorn, and the roaring diesel engines of the transport boats might simply not be heard. Even worse, an audible alarm might trigger a panic or a sudden violent reaction from whoever was carrying the contraband. Instead, the teletouch system communicates entirely through silent visual confirmation. When the magnetic field is disrupted, a highly delicate mechanical relay inside the gray cabinet trips. On the control console sitting on the guard's desk, a small amber-colored glass indicator light quietly illuminates. During the daylight hours, when the transport ferry arrives and the dock is suddenly crowded with returning guards, civilian contractors, and wooden supplies of crates, the officer inside the shack watches that single amber light with unblinking, unbroken intensity. It is a silent, completely objective judge. If it glows, the line halts immediately. The individual or the cargo currently standing in the archway is physically isolated, surrounded quietly by armed guards, and subjected to a thorough, exhaustive manual search until the offending metal is located. The machine possesses no discretion. It holds no biases, and it cannot be reasoned or negotiated with. It simply registers the physical properties of the world passing through it. But tonight, the dock is completely empty. The last boat has long since departed, and the next ferry will not arrive until the sun comes up. The only movement outside the shack is the swirling gray fog and the occasional heavy splash of a white-capped wave breaking over the lower concrete steps of the seawall. The guard on duty here works the most physically isolated post on the entire island. He is entirely disconnected from the heavily fortified cell house at the summit, separated by the steep, winding incline of the switchbacks and the quiet, sleeping residential neighborhood of Building 64.
If an incident were to occur down here at the water's edge, it would take several minutes for reinforcements to run down the hill from the main building. His primary connection to the rest of the facility is the heavy, black rotary telephone resting on his desk, wired directly to the control center in the administrative wing, and the steady, warm, comforting glow of the vacuum tubes above his head. His job on the night watch is not to process arriving shipments, but to maintain the absolute, verified integrity of the perimeter. He must ensure that the teletouch circuit remains unbroken and highly sensitive, constantly verifying that the heavy sea salt, the driving rain, and the constant dampness have not corroded the electrical connections in the wooden archway. The Bureau of Prisons leaves nothing to assumption. Every hour, on the hour, the guard must perform a physical calibration test. He checks his wristwatch. It is time. He stands up from the wooden chair, the joints popping slightly in the cold, and buttons his heavy wool overcoat up to his chin. He pulls a thick canvas fisherman's cap gown over his forehead. From his pocket, he retrieves a ring of brass keys specifically cast from a non-magnetic alloy so they will not accidentally trigger the system during his normal movements. In his other hand, he picks up a small, heavy rectangular block of pure ferrous test steel. He pushes open the door of the shack. The wind instantly howls into the small room, scattering a few loose papers on the desk and chilling the air in seconds. He steps out into the driving mist, pulling the door shut behind him. He walks slowly toward the wooden archway, his rubber boots slipping slightly on the wet concrete of the dock. The foghorn blasts its deep two-tone warning out in the bay, vibrating in his chest. He steps squarely through the center of the teletouch frame, holding the heavy steel block out in front of his coat. He stops, turns around, and looks back through the condensation-streaked window of the guard shack. Through the smeared glass, shining brightly in the dim interior, the small amber light on the console is glowing perfectly. The magnetic field is active. The perimeter holds. He walks back to the shack, steps inside, and gratefully shuts the door against the roaring wind. He wipes the cold moisture from his face with a heavy cotton handkerchief, sets the block of test steel back on the desk, and presses a small toggle switch on the console to reset the relay. The amber light clicks off. He picks up his brass-capped fountain pen, opens his leather logbook, and carefully records the exact time and the successful result of the hourly test. The scratch of the steel nib on the paper is accompanied by the rhythmic ticking of his watch and the low, steady hum of the cabinet resuming its watch. It is a slow, methodical, deeply solitary ritual of verification, repeated endlessly in the dark.
The isolation of this post allows the mind to wander. Staring at the darkened bulb on the console, it is easy to think about the sheer mass of steel and concrete suspended hundreds of feet above him at the top of the island. The teletouch was highly effective at keeping unauthorized metal off the rock, ensuring that the inmates in B and C blocks had to rely on whatever crude scraps they could steal from the industrial workshops to fashion shivs or tools. But the guard knows that while this machine was a marvel of 1930s engineering, perfectly designed to prevent weapons from breaching the outer walls, it was, of course, entirely useless against the heavy surgical saws, the long steel scalpels, and the iron restraints that the Bureau of Prisons deliberately carried into the facility themselves. High above the cell blocks, situated on the second floor above the main dining hall, behind a locked door that smells intensely of ether, iodine, and bleached cotton, lies a vast, empty room filled with this authorized metal.
The inmates are heavily guarded, but their bodies still break, they still fall ill, and they still age. We will walk the quiet, sterile aisles of that medical ward next to see exactly how the island managed the inevitable collapse of the human body in a place where no one was allowed to leave. The island is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the wire fences above the bay, but inside the stone, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
A heavy glass-fronted medical cabinet stands securely bolted against a wall of pale seafoam green tile. Inside, resting on perfectly leveled glass shelves, are rows of identical brown glass apothecary's bottles, their ground glass stoppers sealed tight. The ambient light of the corridor catches the sharp, chrome-plated edges of surgical retractors, bone saws, and heavy steel forceps laid out in precise geometric rows on a lower shelf. The air in this enclosed space is entirely different from the drafty, salt-tinged chill of the main cell blocks or the stagnant warmth of D block. It smells deeply and permanently of phenol, bleached cotton, ether, and the sharp, coppery tang of drying iodine. This is the Alcatraz hospital ward. It is located on the second floor of the main building, situated directly above the massive expanse of the inmates' dining hall. To reach it, the night guard has walked up a wide, reinforced concrete staircase at the eastern end of the cell house, moving completely away from the stacked tiers of Broadway. You would expect the medical facilities in a mid-20th century maximum security prison to be little more than a crude triage center, a single room with a cot, some bandages, and a locked cabinet of aspirin, used only to stabilize injured men before shipping them back to the mainland for surgery, dental work, or prolonged illness. Instead, the medical wing on this island is a comprehensive, fully functioning, self-contained hospital. When the Federal Bureau of Prisons took over the facility and began their massive retrofitting project in 1934, they faced a severe logistical problem. The central philosophy of Alcatraz was absolute isolation. The administration could not afford the security risk of routinely transporting dangerous inmates back across the bay to civilian hospitals in San Francisco for surgery, dental work, or prolonged illness. Every time a prisoner left the island, the carefully engineered containment of the rock was compromised. Therefore, the Bureau of Prisons mandated that the penitentiary must be able to handle any physical ailment internally. They utilized the massive space on the second floor, part of the original overarching military construction built between 1910 and 1912, and transformed it into a sterile, highly equipped medical environment. As the guard walks slowly down the central corridor of the hospital, his rubber soles squeak sharply against the small, white octagonal ceramic tiles that line the floor. The hospital consists of several distinct, specialized rooms branching off from this main artery. He passes the open doorway of the dental clinic. Inside, dominating the center of the room, sits a massive cast iron and porcelain dental chair, upholstered in dark leather. A complex armature of nickel-plated drills and water hoses hangs suspended beside it. Dental care was a frequent necessity on the island, not as a luxury, but to ensure the men could eat the standard rations without requiring specialized blended meals that would disrupt the rigid kitchen schedule. During the day, an inmate dentist, often a man convicted of a white-collar crime or someone who had demonstrated years of compliant behavior, would assist a visiting civilian dentist under heavy, armed supervision. Tonight, the chair is empty, its leather cold, the nickel polished and gleaming softly in the dark.
Further down the hall, the guard stops before a set of wide, swinging double doors with small circular viewing windows cut into the wood at eye level.
He pushes gently against the brass kick plates, and the doors swing inward on silent hinges. He steps into the operating theater. The room is large, walls tiled entirely in white to reflect the maximum amount of light. In the exact center of the floor sits a heavy, adjustable steel surgical table. Suspended directly above it from the concrete ceiling is a massive, multifaceted surgical lamp. The lamp consists of dozens of carefully angled mirrors designed to focus a bright, shadowless beam of light onto the patient's body, preventing the surgeon's own hands from obscuring his vision during a procedure. This room has seen appendectomies, the setting of complex bone fractures, and the surgical repair of stab wounds. The presence of this room is a stark reminder of the authorized metal on the island. Down at the wharf, the teletouch machine constantly scans for hidden blades, yet here, meticulously organized in the locked cabinets surrounding the surgical table, are hundreds of incredibly sharp steel scalpels, heavy bone-cutting shears, and long, piercing suturing needles. The administration brought these weapons into the facility willingly, classifying them as medical necessities. The security protocols governing this room during the day are absolute. Every single instrument is counted, logged, and locked away before the inmate patient is even permitted to wake from the anesthesia. The guard sweeps his flashlight over the empty surgical table, verifying that the room is secure before letting the doors swing shut behind him. Illness in a maximum security environment is handled through strict procedural bureaucracy. An inmate cannot simply walk into the hospital when he feels unwell. Instead, he must report his symptoms during the morning count. After breakfast, a designated sick line is formed. The men stand in a single-file row along the wall of Times Square, waiting for the medical officer to conduct a brief preliminary evaluation through the bars of a heavily secured gate. Malingering, faking an illness to escape a work detail or simply to break the crushing monotony of the cell block is a constant occurrence. The medical staff is trained to be deeply skeptical, dispensing aspirin and harsh laxatives as the primary treatment for most vague complaints. Only when a condition is physically verifiable and severe is a man permitted to climb the stairs to this second floor. The hospital also contains its own specialized housing units. Past the operating theater, the corridor opens into a general ward with several standard hospital beds lined up against the wall. The frames are white-painted iron, fitted with thick mattresses and crisp white cotton sheets. For an inmate accustomed to the scratchy wool and thin padding of the cells in B block, the hospital beds are a profound temporary physical luxury. But there is a catch. The beds are equipped with heavy leather and steel restraint straps bolted directly to the frames. And just beyond the general ward, down a short intersecting hallway, lies the psychiatric observation unit.
The cells in this psychiatric unit are completely different from the standard confinement cells below. They are larger, and their walls are coated in a thick sound-dampening layer of acoustic tile. There are no bars on the fronts, only solid wooden doors with heavy reinforced glass viewing windows. The men placed in these rooms are not there for punishment, but for observation when the psychological weight of the island finally fractures their minds. The sensory deprivation, the lack of autonomy, and the endless, sweeping routine of the clock often lead to severe mental breakdowns. When an inmate ceases to function within the schedule, when he stops eating, begins speaking to the walls, or attempts to harm himself, he is moved up here. Tonight, the psychiatric cells are quiet. The guard checks the heavy brass locks on the solid wooden doors, verifying they are engaged. The silence up here is different from the silence in D block. It is not a punitive, crushing sensory vacuum. It is the sterile, heavily medicated quiet of a clinical environment. He reaches the end of the hospital corridor. Here, built directly into the reinforced concrete of the original 1910 structure, is a heavy steel vault door, similar to what you would find in a commercial bank. It is painted gray, secured by a complex combination lock and a heavy turning wheel. This is the pharmacy vault. Inside this deeply fortified room sits the facility's supply of narcotics, primarily morphine and heavy barbiturates used for surgery and severe pain management. In a building housing hundreds of men desperate for any chemical escape from their reality, this vault represents the most highly targeted cache on the island. The guard does not have the combination. Only the chief medical officer and the warden hold those numbers. The guard's duty is simply to ensure the heavy steel wheel has not been turned, checking the physical integrity of the seal. He places a hand on the cold steel of the vault door, confirms it is locked, and logs the time in his leather book. He begins his slow walk back toward the stairwell, moving past the darkened operating theater and the silent dental chair. The hospital wing is entirely still, a sterile island suspended above the sleeping prison. The men below are forced to rely on the competence and the heavily guarded tools in these rooms when their bodies fail them. It is a strange, forced intimacy. The same administration that dictates their punishment also meticulously manages their physical survival. The guard reaches the top of the concrete stairs. The sharp smell of phenol begins to fade, replaced by the familiar drafty scent of floor wax and old metal drifting up from the main floor. The night is drawing on. The deep, heavy hours of the mid-watch are finally beginning to slip away. As he descends the stairs, heading back toward the administrative wing, the psychological weight of the shift begins to subtly change. The absolute stillness of the night is finite. Somewhere in the dark, the mechanics of the morning are already waiting to be engaged. Inside the main control center, sitting quietly on a long steel desk, is a specific heavy brass key and a typed roster clipped to a wooden board. Those objects represent the official end of the night, the trigger that will violently rip the cell house out of its sleep. But before that key is turned, and before the deafening crash of the cell doors echoes down Broadway, there is one final, quiet hour to endure before the sun breaks over the bay.
A heavy cast aluminum percolator sits on a small electric hot plate in the guard's break room, its glass top rattling rapidly as dark, boiling coffee bubbles up into the transparent chamber. The sharp, roasted smell of chicory and strong grounds cuts cleanly through the lingering institutional odors of carnauba floor wax, damp wool, and cold concrete. On a steel desk just outside this room, in the main administrative control center, sits a large, highly polished brass key. It rests precisely in the center of a green paper blotter, illuminated by the focused, conical beam of a gooseneck desk lamp. The night shift is entering its final, quietest phase. The deep, heavy hours of the mid-watch have slowly burned away, leaving behind the thin, freezing hour just before dawn. You would expect the transition from night to day in a maximum security penitentiary to be a slow, organic waking, a gradual stirring of the population as the sun rises and light filters through the windows. Instead, at Alcatraz, morning is a sudden, highly mechanical, and violently loud event triggered by a strict set of administrative procedures. But before that mechanical sequence can be initiated on the cell house floor, the official transfer of authority must occur in this quiet office, a process defined by rigorous verification in the exchange of authorized equipment. The guard we have followed throughout the night completes his final patrol of the main floor and pushes through the heavy doors into the administrative wing. Slung over his shoulder on a thick leather strap is the recording watch clock he has carried since dusk. This device, heavily encased in stitched leather and steel, is the object he used at the very beginning of the night when he paused by the small metal box mounted on the corridor wall. He unbuckles the heavy leather strap, sets the clock carefully on the steel desk, and steps back. The shift supervisor, seated behind the desk, reaches for the device. He does not simply take the guard's word that the patrols were completed. The Bureau of Prisons operates on a system of absolute, verifiable proof. The supervisor uses a small, specialized master key to unlock the heavy metal casing of the clock itself. He opens it, revealing a circular paper disc, roughly the size of a saucer. This paper disc has been turning continuously on an internal clockwork mechanism since the night began. Every time the guard reached a designated checkpoint and inserted a stationary station key into the clock, a mechanical pin inside the casing punctured a specific hole in the paper. The supervisor carefully removes the disc and examines it under the bright light of the gooseneck lamp. He is looking for a perfectly evenly spaced pattern of perforations, permanently recording the exact minute the guard arrived at each section of the prison. The paper dial proves that the isolated corners of the island were not ignored, that the solitary cells in D Block were monitored, and that the long, dark stretch of Broadway was actively patrolled. The supervisor traces the tiny holes with the tip of his fountain pen, verifying the steady, unbroken rhythm of the night watch. There are no gaps. The strict schedule was maintained. He nods, logs his signature into a heavy-bound ledger, and files the paper disc away for the official administrative records. Only now is the guard officially relieved of his primary duty.
Outside the thick glass windows of the administrative wing, the maritime environment is undergoing its own slow, immense transition. For the last 10 hours, the acoustic landscape of the island has been dominated by the heavy, two-tone blast of the diaphone foghorn. Now, down in the powerhouse at the southern tip of the island, a civilian technician approaches the massive industrial air compressors. He reaches up and manually turns a heavy iron wheel valve, cutting off the flow of pressurized air to the holding tanks. The horn blasts one final guttural bass note out over the choppy water of the bay, holding for exactly 3 seconds, and then the island falls into a sudden, ringing silence. The thick marine layer that blanketed the rock throughout the night is beginning to thin, breaking apart into low, fast-moving clouds driven by the morning wind. High in the lantern room of the Alcatraz lighthouse, the high-wattage electrical lamp inside the multifaceted Fresnel lens is powered down. The sweeping, metronomic beam of white light disappears. The sky over the rolling hills of Oakland, visible now across the water to the east, begins to turn a pale, bruised purple. The seagulls that roost on the jagged outer rocks below the recreation yard begin to stir, their harsh, erratic cries echoing up the concrete walls. Down at the base of the island, in the residential apartments of Building 64, the day is already fully underway. In the small, brightly lit kitchens, the daytime officers are finishing their breakfasts of eggs and toast. They lace up their polished leather boots, button their crisp, heavy uniform tunics, and step out onto the cold concrete patios. They begin the steep walk up the switchback path, their footsteps crunching rhythmically on the damp gravel. The logistical requirements of managing this specific population demand a massive influx of personnel. To maintain the mandated guard-to-inmate ratio of approximately 1 to 3, dozens of officers must take the floor simultaneously. When the heavy outer doors of the cell house open, the daytime shift steps inside, bringing with them a sudden rush of freezing, salty air. The quiet, solitary murmurs of the night watch are instantly replaced by the professional, efficient greetings of a massive staff preparing for duty. The visual contrast between the two shifts is stark.
The night guards are physically exhausted, their uniforms slightly rumpled from wearing heavy overcoats, their eyes tired from staring into the shifting shadows of the low-wattage nightlights. The day shift is crisp, alert, and moving with the quick, deliberate energy required to manage hundreds of waking men. Before the day shift can step onto the main cell house floor, they must process through the armory. This highly secure room is located entirely outside the main prison envelope, physically separated from the control center and the cell blocks by a thick wall of bulletproof glass and heavy tool-resistant steel grating. The transfer of weaponry and master keys is a meticulous, highly choreographed ritual that admits no variations.
The officers assigned to the elevated gun gallery step up to a small, heavy steel pass-through drawer built into the wall. They hand over small brass identification tallies inscribed with their badge numbers. In exchange, the armory officer unlocks a heavy steel rack behind the glass and begins issuing the authorized medal for the day. He slides out the Springfield .30 caliber rifles, their wooden stocks polished and the actions oiled. He issues the heavy, brass-cased tear gas canisters, placing them carefully into the steel drawer. He hands over the M1911 semi-automatic pistols, dropping the heavy magazines into the palm of his hand to visually verify they are fully loaded before sliding them through the pass-through. The metallic clicks, the heavy clacks of the bolts being checked, and the scrape of leather holsters echo sharply in the administrative corridor. It is the distinct sound of the penitentiary arming itself, preparing to transition from the static, silent containment of the night into the active, heavily populated mechanics of the day. Once armed, the gun gallery guards step away from the window. They unlock the solid steel door leading to the enclosed spiral staircase we climbed hours earlier. They ascend into the shadows, moving to relieve the solitary night watchman suspended high above the cell blocks, ensuring the elevated overwatch is never broken for even a single second. Meanwhile, the unarmed guards assigned to the main floor step through the heavy interior doors and fan out across the polished concrete. They carry only wooden batons and large rings of brass keys. They move deliberately to their designated positions at the far ends of B and C blocks. The temperature inside the main cell house is bitterly cold. Because the overarching structure was built between 1910 and 1912 by military prisoners using massive, continuous pours of reinforced concrete, the building possesses an enormous thermal mass. Once the concrete absorbs the freezing temperatures of the night, it holds the cold deep within the walls, radiating it back into the corridors long after the sun has risen outside. The day guards pull their collars tight as they walk down the center of Broadway, their rubber soles squeaking loudly against the wax. They approach the heavy cast-iron gang boxes bolted flush against the walls at the end of the tiers. They insert their keys, unlock the heavy iron cabinets, and swing the heavy doors open, exposing the thick steel control levers coated in industrial lithium grease. A guard wraps his gloved hand around the master lever, a heavy piece of forged iron mechanically connected to the complex flat bars and gears that run the entire length of the cell block. He stands perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the center of the corridor, waiting for the exact mechanical signal that will begin the morning. This specific, highly regimented morning routine repeated itself, almost exactly, day after day, year after year. The guards stood by these levers, the men woke to the bells, and the count was cleared. It was an endless, grinding cycle of containment that continued unbroken until the relentless, corrosive sea salt and the exorbitant financial cost of operating the island finally defeated the concrete.
The facility would eventually close its doors for good on March 21, 1963, rendering these gang boxes permanently silent.
But this morning, the prison is fully alive. The night guard watches from the doorway of the administrative wing. His shift is officially over. He has surrendered his watch clock, he has signed the leather ledger, and he has successfully transferred the absolute stillness of the night to the men who will manage the noise of the day. He pulls up the collar of his coat and prepares to walk down the hill to the dock, where the first morning ferry from the mainland is already cutting through the choppy gray water of the bay, bringing the mainland mail, fresh milk, and the daily supplies. Everything in the cell house, the guards gripping the heavy iron levers, the armed men pacing the elevated grating in the gun gallery, the kitchen staff standing by the massive steam kettles in the dining hall, is entirely synchronized to the electrical pulse of the master clock system. The men in the standard 5x9 cells of Broadway are still asleep, wrapped tight in their coarse wool blankets, entirely unaware that the physical environment around them has armed itself, changed personnel, and shifted into position. The silence in the cell house is heavy, stretched taut like a piano wire, waiting for the mechanism to snap. The second hand on the large wire-caged analog clock suspended above the intersection of Times Square continues its slow, relentless sweeping arc over the bright white dial. It is approaching 6:30 a.m. The men in the cells are about to wake up, but before the deafening crash of the morning routine shatters the quiet, and before the heavy iron levers are finally thrown, we must finally address the object suspended in the center of that intersection, and fulfill the promise of why that specific dial dictated the psychological survival of every man on the rock.
At exactly 6:30 a.m., an electrical relay inside the master clock engages, sending a current to a heavy brass bell mounted on the cell house wall. The bell rings out, a shrill, violent, continuous clatter that rips through the silence of the cell blocks. The night is instantly over. Hundreds of men jolt awake, throwing off their wool blankets, stepping onto the freezing concrete in a synchronized, involuntary reaction to the noise. 25 minutes later, the guard on Broadway will throw the heavy iron gang box lever, and every single steel door on the tier will rack open simultaneously with a deafening, earth-shaking crash. The men will step out of their cells, form a single silent line, and begin their march toward the dining hall, passing directly beneath the heavy wire cage at Times Square. They will look up at the clock. You were promised an answer as to why this simple mechanism mattered more to these men than any calendar. In a facility designed to be the end of the line, sentences were rarely measured in months. They were measured in decades or in life. A calendar is a map of years. To a man locked in a 5x9 concrete box, looking at a calendar is psychologically crushing. It represents a vast, insurmountable wall of lost time, a future too massive and desolate to comprehend. It breeds despair. The clock, however, measures the immediate present. It measures the 20 minutes allotted for breakfast. It measures the seconds remaining in a shift at the laundry. By breaking their existence down into the smallest possible increments, minute by minute, whistle by whistle, the men could survive the weight of their sentences. The sweeping second hand was the only visible, undeniable proof that their sentence was actually moving forward, that the earth was still turning outside the fog, and that the rigid, unyielding machinery of Alcatraz had not completely frozen them in time. The guard finishes his walk down the hill. The ferry bumps heavily against the wooden wharf. The island is awake now. The gears are turning. Close your eyes. Let the heavy steel doors slide shut.
Let the sweeping beam of the lighthouse fade into the gray morning, and let the deep, quiet history of the rock pull you down into sleep.